Blog Talk Radio.
You're listening to a special edition of Dark Matter Radio with your host, Ronnie McLean. Tonight, you will find that power is knowledge, and the knowledge you gain is freedom. And we're going to test the far out reaches of your mind. We're going to test everything that you believe in. You're going to have an awakening. Tonight, on Dark Matter Radio, with your host, Ron McLean. Come through your mind. Come through your heart. Come through your soul. Come free your mind. Welcome to Dark Matter Radio. Thank you for being here today and this evening. So wherever you may be in this beautiful world of ours, it is just wonderful to be alive, especially in this time, because it's very exciting times, and there's so many different things coming on and going on in this day and age. I tell you, from the killings in Chicago to the murders in New York to Jesse Smollett beating the hell out of himself with a few friends and then getting off scot-free, to you got all kinds of infighting going on inside of the black community, and all these things happening right around the presidential elections as they talk about reparations. And the talk of decolonization hasn't come up yet, but reparations has, recompense, and anybody who doesn't know what that is, it is the outpaying of funds to people of slaves. So there you have all different types of groups that are coming up. And what this show is about is the Black Civil War. The Black Civil War, which is actually taking place right now, destroying the whole entire race of people as they fight against themselves, amongst themselves. And again, a lot of it's turning into just blistering about, who's going to be able to get the money. And so let me just bring you up to speed. There's some pretty major groups out there that are doing a lot of things. You heard of Black Lives Matter. Now, Black Lives Matter isn't part of any kind of a reparations group funded by George Soros and the good gang over there. But they are just a group out there that's just agitating a lot of stuff anytime something happens. And their last attempt was trying to put Colin Kaepernick in the front of it, right? So that pretty much failed miserably. But that old kick a knee thing wasn't nothing more than I am submitting to you. That's about all that was for the black community, and keeping them in a submissive state. So that didn't really work out so well, but it did get a lot of attention. And but there are some other major players. So you get a lot of these new acronyms coming up, such as what will we say? The acronyms that are coming like ADOS, African Descendants of Slaves, or Descendants of African Slaves. Then we got the Indigenous Aboriginal Movement, and the Indigenous Aboriginal Movement, or the copper-colored people who have been here and have been here before any of the Indians, etc. We'll get into all those. We're going to break down these groups a bit. We have the Black Hebrews, or the Hebrew Israelites. That connotation, black, was put in there for a reason from white Americans. We also have the Moors. Now, again, the Moor Science Temple and all that other type stuff, they have, a lot of things going on with them, but they're part of this conversation here. We have the people of the Caribbean. I know you don't consider them to be part of the mainland of the Americas, but we'll get into that because they have the Taíno and Arawak people who are part of them. And we have a race that I call the race that then you got the race of people that I call just going to wait for my time. And those people have been around for quite a long time. And then we also have another new group that's popping on the scene, which is the Republic of Mentalek by Nuben Menkarez. And we had him on the show about 3 years ago. About 3 years ago when we first started. And there he was knee deep in a lot of different really interesting stuff. But his group is the Bright Race, and he's bringing a lot of people like that online. And that's quite interesting. And we'll get into a lot of that too, right? So these fractions, now the Bright Race really isn't fighting against anyone. They're just doing their own thing. But we have the African Americans, black people of the United States. Now that's a whole other group because that's the main group that everybody knows. And that's the group that is pretty much underneath the thumb of what you would call the American corporations of the United States, right? These are the people that they actually let loose and out of slavery. They never really freed them from slavery. They let them loose out of slavery. And they never really ended the war. We'll get into that. And they never really did anything for them. I mean, a lot of their, they say that they're citizens, but they're really not citizens of any state. That was discussed in a big, giant lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, and that was upheld. And, regardless of all these different acts and stuff like that, the Civil Rights Act, and these Civil Rights Acts have been going on since the 1800s, and it doesn't really fly with a lot of stuff. I mean, you got the Reconstruction and things like that. But, it's really a shame because this programming that's been going on with inside of the black community has been going on for quite some time. And we need to be able to have an understanding as to why these fractions, these groups can never really get together. And that's because of the programming. They're programmed to keep themselves separated, and they're programmed to keep themselves in a state of mental war and even physical war, as you can see from a lot of the videos that you might put on out there and on YouTube and stuff like that. You see black people fighting all over the place. Now, it's not like that 100% of the time, all the time, everywhere that you go. But this is a huge mindset in a lot of the areas that we go around the country. So it's very important for us to keep that under wraps. And you also tend to think, why can't the black community, being the third largest minority group in the United States, why can't they ever really get themselves together, right? They used to be the second minority, but now they're the third largest minority because first we have the whites, Caucasians, anybody who fits in that group, and then we have Hispanics. And Hispanics are, anywhere between, any of the Hispanic cultures that are of the islands in North America, South America, Central America. They lump them all together. And some of them can also be considered to be white because a lot of them put white on the census papers. So then you have the black Americans. And you also have the Native Americans, which are not American Indians. They're Native Americans, right? In Canada, they'll be called First Nations. They even called Aboriginals and a lot of other different designations that they have for them up there as well, right? But they're all part of the North American diaspora. So, and then when you talk about all these different entities, it gets into a really serious situation because it's all surrounding this reparations, decolonization, recompense subject, right? So now you have a lot of people that are infighting. They're fighting about one another, and they're fighting to see who's more Aboriginal than one Aboriginal. Because the Aboriginals, the Aboriginal Indigenous Movement, that community, they're fighting in one another, right? And they're having all different types of issues. The blacks, they're all separated in their own little angles, whether it's religion, politics, Democrat, Republicans, Green Party, and all that other type stuff. All these fractions keep them apart. Then you have all the Me Too movement and stuff like that. So you have all these different infighting, but it's getting really bad because the people from the African descendants of slaves are really lashing out at the Aboriginal community, and they're really, really, really bashing them pretty hard about how they hate themselves and how they're denying their African ancestry and all that other type stuff. So I wanted to really get down into it, and then get down into the meat and the basics of these different groups, what they are, what they truly mean, and how can they actually really think that they're actually really fighting in a direction that's going to be any kind of positive. Because the main thing that I want to tell you here is that we, or the Americans, or the Black Americans, or the people of the United States that are all different types of persuasions, must all fight together under one banner, coming at it in the same direction. Because right now they aren't doing anything, because you got to think of it that everybody's in jail. And when you think of it that everybody's in jail, what happens is that all they're doing is in their part of the jail, they're coming together, they're fighting against one another, the buzzer beeps, and everybody's got to go back to the jail cell. They have absolutely no power whatsoever. Absolutely no power whatsoever. So one of the things that I wanted to do is start with the Hebrew Israelites. Maybe we start with the Hebrew Israelites, also called the Black Hebrew Israelites, or African Hebrew Israelites, and again, that word Hebrew Israelites with black was put in there for a bad connotation, right? Bringing them into the diaspora of the thing that they created about black people, because, you went from American Indian, you went from wherever you were, because we don't know what they actually were calling themselves, but you went from wherever you were to your empire or civilization name, Inca, Californian, Calis, Mayans, etc. Then you went into American Indians, right? And then you went into Negro. Then you went from Negro to black, and then black to African American, right? So this is the reason why they put all those connotations in there, right? They really throw you off. But the Americans who believe they are descendants, right? These Hebrew Israelites believe that they are descendants of the ancient Israelites. The Hebrews adhere to a varying degrees of religious beliefs and practices of both Christianity and Judaism, right? Which is a kicker right there, because you have both of those fractions that are in each other, but seemingly sometimes at each other's throat. But we want to look at the etymology of the word, right? The etymology of the word comes from Cush, Cushi, right? Or Kush, Kushi. And Hebrew, right? And that means Hebrew Cush, right? Is a term generally used in the Hebrew Bible to refer to dark-skinned people, carbon-based beings, in other words, people who are carbon-based, right? And the definitive origin of the term Hebrew remains uncertain, right? And, of course, in their books it remains uncertain, because what happened is it originated before the people who are called Jews now actually came into the picture, right? That's a story of another day. But commonly means coming from the other side. Now, this is going to be important when we begin to start talking about this. Coming from the other side, or pass over, or passing over, right? So when we look a little deeper into this, we begin to start understanding that perhaps maybe what they're talking about is the origin of what you call a phir, O-P-H-I-R, which is an ancient place where the origination of these people actually came from. Right, and we'll get into that in just a minute, right? But there's also King Solomon also had a port that was named Ophir, right? O-P-H-I-R, right? And that's where he got all of his gold and stuff like that came from, right? So now you look at it, the Brazilian Indians are the descendants of the ancient tribe that they claim was sent by King Shem, King Solomon, right, to celebrate the land of Ophir in order to fetch wood for the construction of the temples and everything else that they were doing, right? A descendant of Shem through Akopashed, Shelah, Eba, and Qatar, right, the 11th, right, and Joktan's 13th son, right? Well, I'm getting a little deep in here, but I just need the people who know a little about this to follow this, right? So Ophir was probably born about 200 years before Abraham. Now, this is before the actual Judaism thing actually began starting, right? These are where these people come from, who was a descendant of his perpetual uncle, Plagueis, P-E-L-E-G, Plague, right? As in the case of the brothers, it appears that Afar also headed one of the Semite tribes that was numbered among the descendants of Noah, according to their families and according to the tongues of their lands and according to their nations, right? So why is this important? It's important because it is known that Solomon, right, had people in South America, in the Americas, right? And it was in that place that it was called, and there's a place there now still called Ophir, right? O-P-H-I-R. And when we begin to start breaking down this word, right, of Hebrew, meaning from the other side or passing over, we begin to start understanding that they probably, or perhaps maybe, some of the historians landing on something right, saying that the Hebrews actually came from the Americas. And this is one of the reasons why they were so looked after and looked down upon, because they were not actually from the original area. And as we know, over 600 out of the 600, I think 70 foods that are in Africa today actually come from North America and South America, come from the Americas. So one of the things that and then when we get into the slave trade, a lot of the slave trade actually involved the Hebrew Israelites, because they were the ones, the Africans were actually sending on those trips over to the Americas. And in other words, they may have been sending them back home where they belong, because they were not of the original people. And this is why they never felt sad or sorry that they were sending people into slavery. The other part about the slavery thing is, and we'll get to that in a minute when we talk about the Americans, is that a lot of the recycled slaves came from the Americas itself. So that's the Hebrew Israelites, right? And then we get into the Caribbean people, right? The Taíno, the indigenous Caribbeans, right? The Taínos were an Arawak people who were the indigenous people of the Caribbean and all those islands, right? And Florida, right? They were based in Florida, and as we know, the Inca Empire and the Mayan Empire and all those empires and stuff like that spread all the way into those areas. So they had an influence on everything that was going on over there, right? At the time the Europeans contacted them in the late 15th century, 1492 as they claim, there were principal inhabitants. They were the principal inhabitants of Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, which is, again, a name of what they did, because when they came here, they began to start renaming everything right away, which is Dominican Republic and Haiti, and also Puerto Rico, right? So on these islands, there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands, and perhaps maybe a couple of million people that were on these islands. And by the time Columbus got finished, there were probably, less than 500,000 people left. And in fact,
fiercest, most horrible servitude and captivity, which no one who has not seen it can understand. Even beasts enjoy more freedom when they are allowed to graze in the fields, but our Spaniards gave no such opportunity to Indians and truly considered them perpetual slaves. I sometimes came upon dead bodies on my way, and upon others who were grasping and moaning in their death agony, repeating, "Hungry, hungry." And this was the freedom, the good treatment, and the Christianity the Indians received.
And in fact, the first slaves actually were deported from the United States, from what we know the Caribbean islands, back into Europe, 500 of them, based on the next people we're going to be talking about, his friends, the Moors. So that's what's going on in the Caribbean, in short. So we have the Moors now. The Moors are a nomadic people from North Africa. Originally, they were the inhabitants of Maturina. They invaded Spain, taking their Islamic religion. And I have to get you back into the Islamic religion, because naturally these people over there in that North African region were not Islamic, right? And the culture with them in 711. they overran the Nigagos, right? And Moor derived from the Greek word Moranus, plural from Morani, right? M-A-U-R-R-O-I, I believe, means black or very dark, carbon-based, right? So we're getting back into Moors actually means the color of their skin, means the color base of their skin, right? Not a being of people, but they were just a description of what they look like, which in Latin became Morano, plural Morani. The Latin word for black was niger, N-I-G-E-R, not Morano. Or in Latin, fucus, F-U-S-C-O, for very dark. In the case of the Moors, were described as fuckus, right? So they were described as fuckus. And so in the Urban Dictionary, we have that broken down into a very dark-skinned person or dark-skinned person, a fool, a silly person, an immature teenager, dark brown. So, you have to remember the Moors didn't start out as Islamic. The Moors had their own culture based in in the land and things that they came from, right? Some people will say, oh, they were pagans and all this other type of stuff. Well, some of them believe in multiple gods, whatever. When the Muslims came, they came with violence and force, slaughtered a whole lot of them. Millions and millions and millions of them, slaughtered millions and millions of them, and converted all those people by force. Now, they couldn't get into North Africa. I mean, they couldn't get to the South Africa, Mid-Africa range because the forces down there were just too strong for them, right? They beat them back. So this is where the Moors are coming from, right? So the Moors, so even George Washington said about the Moors, he said, we can't allow the Moors to know exactly who and what they are, where they came from, and what their history is. And he said that we, for the life of us, must make sure that they never, 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 ever return to the original roots, right? That's what they said about the American Indians, the Aboriginal, the indigenous people in the Americas. He called them Moors. So the reason why he called them Moors was because they were dark-skinned people. Dark-skinned people. So, very, very, very interesting in a lot of those kinds of things. And then when you get down to the African Americans, what we have with the African Americans is you pretty much know what they are, right? African Americans also refer to Black Americans, Afro Americans, or an ethnic group of the Americas with a total or partiality ancestry from the Black racial groups of Africa. The term typically refers to the descendants of enslaved Black people who are from the United States. Black Americans, African Americans constitute the third largest racial group in the United States. We talked about that already, right? Most of the Americans are descendants of slaves, as they would like you to believe, which is not. So we're going to get into that now, because when you talk about African Americans, blacks being descendants of African slaves, you have to understand that only 375,000 at best, 400,000 out of a 500-year period actually made it to the shores of the United States. Most of those Africans, a lot of those Africans were Hebrews, and then you also talk about a lot of those Africans that were recycled Americans or indigenous beings that came from North America and South America themselves, right? And that were brought back here. And they actually hit the shores here. And then those that actually hit the shores here was in such bad shape, they didn't survive for too long. So the actual, what you would call African, that actually hit the shores of the United States was probably less than 200,000 people, maybe less than that. There were more African immigrants in the 1960s and 70s than there were the whole entire time that they were bringing Africans in for the slavery, right, for the slave trade. Sorry about that. They got a little brain freeze there. So you got to understand that, right? The Neutralization Act of 1990 limited U.S. citizenship only to whites, and only white men who were property and could vote, right? The circumstances were changed, as I said, during Reconstruction, but it really wasn't, because a lot of these things were not really adhered to the Supreme Court, right, in terms of all the things that they were doing with that. So I want to bring you back to that. So those are the fractions that we have there. Then we have the nation of Mentellec, the bright race, right, the Republic of Mentellec. The Republic of Mentellec has come to represent the next level of law an extended order amongst the evolving race of the advanced beings known as the bright race, or the Mentalalians. This community order of Amen, which is the God of all gods, will only house brighter beings with a collective and intellectual outlook and inner vision of towards the higher self, and towards the higher self, right? And that's just, you know, again, that's a whole nother ball game, and they're just completely running off and doing their own thing with now what you call the prophet Nuben Menkares. I'm seeing now that we're probably going to have another show, right? We're down to about 5 minutes on this show. We're probably going to have another show to get into that. So we're going to call this part 1 of a part 2 series of the Black Civil War. And that's what we're going to do. So it's very important for us to understand, that these fractions and these groups that are being mentioned now are the fractions and groups that are fighting amongst each other, right? They're fighting with inside of themselves, and then they're also fighting amongst each other as separate respective groups. And, you know, nothing about this is constructive at all, and that's where I want to begin to start getting into why this Black Civil War is taking place in the first place. Because it's getting very brutal and vicious on YouTube. You know, it's getting very brutal and vicious on social media and a lot of these social media pages. And it's getting really crazy because there is no constructive behavior behind this at all in terms of moving the whole entire process forward, right? And then you have people, I mean, a lot of the people in the African American society don't even know what's actually really going on. They're just hearing about it, and they'll hear about it a little bit more and more as their politicians begin to start bringing it up. And, you know, and again, with the brainwashing and everything, they automatically fall into a certain diaspora of mentality and just going along with whatever the flow is. And so it is very important to have an understanding of what's going on with all these different types of beings. And there's other ones out there as well, not so much getting into everything, but it's more the politicians of the African Americans, it's more the Moors, the Hebrew Israelites, and the Aboriginal Indigenous community that are involved in a lot of these things that we're going to be talking about here in terms of the Civil War and them attacking and brutally attacking each other on social media and in other areas, right? So it is this that we must get ready to leave you off with. Just going to check the time here. Yeah, so we got 2 minutes. So we're going to leave you off with this one. We're going to come back. But we're going to leave you off with this. And what we're going to leave you off with is, what is a definition of an American? It's a noun, a Native American, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to descendants of Europeans born in America. The name American must exalt and exhibit patriotism. So George Washington added that last part on there because he knew that he must make sure that that original name of American is now transferred over to the new people, and that's what they were doing. And this is one of the things that are happening because we've been transferred into so many different pockets that this is the reason why this Black Civil War right now is going on. And it's a setup. It's really a setup. It's a mental game to make sure that there is no productive action that's going to be taking place in the community whatsoever. And so this is the reason why we have what we have, and the war coming on. And it is horrible, it's terrible, and we're going to pick this up again in another show and make sure that we are going to talk about this in much more detail in terms of how these people are fighting against each other and the 4 steps that it's going to need to take. It's going to take a bringing together of the people, ending of the war, which we'll talk about. Then it's decolonization, and then we can begin to get into a few other different things that we talk here. This is Ronnie McLean for Dark Matter Radio. We thank you for being here, and we'll talk to you soon.
That's it. Yeah, you can stop it now.